Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. And of course my favourite line. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. Let's talk about description. Description, like action and dialogue, is all about a balancing act. You want enough of it so that the reader feels anchored in your story and is able to follow along with what's going on, but you also don't want so much that they become bored or overloaded and your story becomes bloated. Each book will require a different amount of description, and it will depend on the type of book and the type of description. But to figure out how much and of what type of description is best for your book, we need to look at what description does. What are its purposes? And I'd like to break these down into 5 different categories. First, description provides setting. It provides an anchor point for your reader to say, aha, I understand where I am and who these people are and what's going on. Second, description sets pacing. Third, description adds beauty to the text. Fourth, it sets mood. And fifth, it provides commentary on what's going on and on who's doing it. So let's start out with providing setting. Really good books, really good descriptions will allow the reader to basically feel like they're there or sufficiently there. They don't have to think about it a lot. This comes back to the rule of using all 5 senses, and all 9 if you wish, to provide that feeling of setting. You should know what it looks like, what it smells like, what it sounds like, what it tastes like, and what it feels like. And you don't have to have all 5 senses in every single description, but at some points you should have all 5 throughout the books. So I should be able to feel, if I'm in 1800s London, that it's, let's say it's summer, so it is damp, and I can, like, my clothing is sticking to me, and this stinking smell of the Thames is rising into the air, and the soot is heavy upon my tongue, and the carriages are rattling by. I should be able to know all these things, and if the story is good enough, I shouldn't have to wonder about, I shouldn't have to ask, where am I? I know that I'm indoors. I know this and that. This means that, to some extent, description is required in every scene. We'll get into this a little bit more in a moment, but there's this rule of thumb that in action scenes you have less description, and in non-action scenes you have more because of pacing. But you always need to have some. I talked in my action video on the importance of using your setting as part of your action. So for example, you can use a chair as a weapon to, you pick up the chair and bash on someone. But if the reader doesn't know we're inside in the sort of room that has chairs in it, that will come out of nowhere, and it will be disorienting, and it will also be difficult for the reader to become invested, because it's like, well, just anything can happen because we don't know what's in that room. We don't know what tools are at our disposal. So you always need description of some sort. Now, when you're not in the middle of an action scene, you can, of course, spend longer periods of time on description. One book that has a huge amount of description is Walter Moore's 13 and a Half Lives of Captain Blue Bear, which I have right here, along with all the rest of his books that have been translated into English. There's an enormous quantity of description in this book, but it doesn't become boring because it fits in the universe, and he does it at times that it's not like, oh wait, hold on, we were in the middle of something. But then this does come back to also my second point, which is description sets pacing. More description will slow the pacing to some extent. Not so much if it's good description. It actually can be used to increase tension. Come back to that in a second. More description slows the pacing, less description speeds it up. One big mistake of this, though, especially in the aforementioned action scenes, is that authors will cut down on the description so much because they want to speed the action that the reader isn't given time to process what's going on. You're just racing from point to point, you're just shifting the camera so quickly that their brains don't have enough time to actually register and therefore care about the events. And that's part of why, even in the fastest scenes, you don't want them to be too fast. You need to use description enough to slow them down so that the reader can keep up with you and be invested. This is also a really fabulous way to build tension, if done correctly and in the moment, and see my video on building tension for that. But if we're in a really tense scene, if we're inside a haunted house and walking down the hallway, you actually want a lot of description here, because you want that slow, tense build. You want to maybe hear that creak, or you want to, like in the Amityville Horror, the flies are back. And if you just say flies, that's good. But if you mention buzzing, or you mention the tiny flitterings of their wings, those little details and how they're just a mass of black, that increases the tension. That makes it scarier. That makes the reader more involved because it makes it more real. Of course, if you do too much, or the wrong variety, it just bogs your story down. So again, balance is important. Before I go on to the fourth and fifth ones, and of course tie them into the earlier material, I do want to briefly go back to my third point, which is description adds beauty to the text. The poem I read from was Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. I love Poe. I think he has some of the most beautiful descriptions, and not just in his poetry, but some of what he does in The Raven is that he uses different literary techniques. He uses alliteration and the silken satin certain rustling of each purple curtain. That's all those nice sounds. And it lends an extra something to the text. Every author out there, every writer, even when they're trying to mimic other writers, has their own style, their own flair, their own flavor that makes them uniquely them, and it can never entirely be replicated. When I was a kid, I was an enormous fan of the Animorphs series by K.A. Applegate, and I read them obsessively over and over again. Until about the mid-20s, actually right after the David trilogy, numbers 20 through 22, and then suddenly nothing had seemed to change in the book, in the style, but I just enjoyed them less, and it wasn't until years later that I figured out why, which is, that's the point she started using ghostwriters. And the ghostwriters, well, solid writers, weren't her, and didn't have the particular flair that she had that drew me into the book, that uniquely her bit. This is something that uniquely you, that you should always bring out in writing, not suppress. Now, don't do this to the detriment of your book. Don't be like, well, I'm just a sort of writer who uses very in every sentence, so get over it. It's style. No. But beauty and description is a good way to do this. Just having that little bit of alliteration, that little bit of a more interesting description, which we'll get more into in points 4 and 5, it will make your text beautiful, and it doesn't matter your genre. It will always improve your story and improve your reader's enjoyment, even if they don't notice the beauty of your description. Unless, of course, you're writing a book like The 13.5 Lives of Captain Blue Bear, in which case, yes, they will notice. So, tied into this beauty is points 4 and 5, which I'll sort of talk about together, which are, it sets the mood and it gives commentary. How you describe things within a book matters. If you're in an action scene and you're like, I went into a room and there was a table and a chair and a tea kettle, that's boring, and it has no real flavor to it. It's just a list of things. And so yes, although you're providing the reader with this information, and you can even do it like with all 5 sentences, like, there was a chair, and it felt like wood, and it smelled like sawdust, and it sounded like knocking on wood, and it tasted like splinters. That's strange, but it's not, it doesn't give the reader the feeling of being immersed in the world, because that's not how people experience the world. People experience the world through their own personal filters. So if I walked into a neon lit bar, I hate neon. I mean, I hate neon lights. I have very light sensitive eyes, and there are certain types of lights, fluorescent lights, backlit screens, neon lights, that just mess with my head. And so if I walked into a neon lit bar, I would have a very different experience of it than someone who just absolutely loved bars and spent their time there voluntarily and were like, yes, I love that neon. And so by incorporating this into my description, I can very easily help set the tone of the scene and also help give commentary on the perspective of my character. So let's say my character is someone like me who doesn't like neon. I could, instead of just saying there were neon lights, I could say something like, the filthy bar beneath the sickly glow of the neon lights. Or if my character was someone who just loved neon, I could say something along the lines of, the neon lights lent life to the otherwise filthy bar. Of course, filthy in itself gives a lot of commentary. There are different words in the English language that give commentary in different ways. I read a book. It was actually a book that I got by mistake, because I thought it was by a different author, but ended up loving, called The Gentle Art of Verbal Self-Defense at Work. And it's part of a whole series. There's a lot of the same material in all of them. I've actually read about 5 of the series now. But one thing that she talks about a lot is sensory language. She says that every person has a different sensory language, and primarily sight is the most common, followed by hearing, followed by touch. And under circumstances of extreme stress, people tend to revert to their primary sensory language. So if my sensory language were sight, and I were trying to resolve a conflict which was very tense, I might say to this person, look, I see what you mean, but if my sensory language were hearing, I might say, I hear where you're coming from, but. Or if it were touch, like I feel you, man, but. And by communicating with the other person in the same sensory language as they have, it helps them, well, feel like they're coming from the same place, and therefore helps arguments be resolved more quickly. Whereas if you come to them with a different sensory language, it'll be clashing heads more. So if one person is like, I just want to be heard, and the other person says, like, yeah, I feel where you're coming from, then it's like they're speaking 2 different languages, and because it's a high tense situation, they're both reverting to their primary sensory language, it doesn't help. I think mine's sight, but I'm not sure. One of the very interesting things she mentions is that there's negative connotation to, in US culture at least, to touch sensory language, because depending on who you are, if you're male, you're female, young or old, touch may be more or less socially acceptable. And the other thing she mentioned is that taste and smell metaphors and descriptions tend to be negative. So something smells fishy in here, or that leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Often these are the sorts of things we have, and you can use that as a writer. You can say, okay, I want to bring a very negative connotation to this, so I should focus more on the smell and taste of the place. Although of course you can turn this around. And I can also use loaded words like filthy. Filthy is a much more loaded word than simply saying very dirty, and it's also a more interesting word. But beyond that, you can use your descriptions in ways, using metaphors to give commentary and give your protagonists, your narrators, opinion on subjects. So instead of using the boring, she had brown eyes, you could, if you wanted a positive connotation to this, use the, this is a cliche, so I don't actually use this one, but like, she had chocolate eyes. And if you want a negative connotation, you could say she had excrement-colored eyes. Or the the word of your choice that means such. And this, it tells you a lot about the person describing it, whoever your narrator is, even if it's a third person narrator, whoever's point of view it's from. And it tells you something about that person and their relationship while bringing a sort of beauty and interest to the text. So all these things work together. The one thing you do want to avoid is using the same sort of boring descriptions a lot in a list. I recommend when writing descriptions, first of all, stop and be like, what sense haven't I used recently? But also think, is this memorable? Do I want to say that Harry Potter has green eyes, or that he has bottle green eyes, or that he has emerald green eyes, or that he has eyes the color of the killing curse? What am I trying to tell my reader here? Every book is different. Every book will require a slightly different balance, but as long as you provide enough description and keep that description interesting enough, it will improve your book vastly. Good luck, everyone.